In this screencast, we're going to consider the connection between listening and research. And I want you to really think about these things that we're talking about as you begin your research process and as you're choosing your topic, because you don't want to start out with an assumption. So to do this, we're going to consider the Reverend Jeffrey Brown's story as an example, and we're going to analyze his process and where he initially took a wrong turn. So if any of you haven't listened to the podcast telling his story, you should pause this, go back, listen to that first, because you're going to want to hear the whole story. So as you know, Jeffrey Brown started out as a young minister at the United Baptist Church in Metro Boston. And his community, like many others at the time, was facing a change. There was an increase in violence, and the homicide rate was going up. And this changed the community itself. People were scared. They weren't going out at night, and they were worried about their community. And Jeffrey Brown wanted to try and find a solution to this. So he preached. He stood in front of his congregation and shared his thoughts and ideas on all of this, and he began programs that would involve the youth after school and all of that. Maybe not basketball, but a basketball hoop is way easier to draw than a math club. So I want to pause for a second and think about, why did he choose these actions? What was his motivation? What was his rationale for thinking those things would fix the problem? Did he go to the library and did he research and read sociology articles? Did he talk to experts? Did he talk to lawyers? Did he talk to sociologists and therapists and behavioral scientists? Did he talk to police officers who were out on the streets? He didn't. Instead, he did what Geico says preachers do. If you're a preacher, you preach. And so what happened? Well, the violence didn't go down, and Jesse McKee died 150 feet from the church steps. And this was a wake-up call to Reverend Brown, because if Jesse had made it to those steps, he wouldn't have been able to find help anyway, because the church was literally closed off from the community member who needed it. So why didn't it work? Right? This, I would say, is the wrong question to ask. What you really want to ask is, why should it have worked? If this question was asked before the preaching and before the programs, it may have saved some time, right? You want to have good reason for believing that your solution is going to work. So he made a few missteps in the beginning. He started with the assumption that preaching and programs would be a solution to this issue, instead of starting with questions. Why is this happening? Who is involved? When is this happening? Why is this happening now? Why is this happening within our community? Is it happening everywhere else in the same way? You want questions to drive your research. And then the other two parts here are similar. He didn't define his terms, right? So he himself said he needed to refine his vision of community, and he wasn't talking to the right audience. So when he talks about community and defining his terms, is community just this little bubble here around the church and it's just the congregation, or should it include the people who aren't sitting in the pews? Obviously, Reverend Brown wanted to reach outside of his church walls. And that meant he was talking to the wrong audience, right? He was literally preaching to the choir. They were already on board with him. He needed to move out, and he needed to explore and investigate, and he needed to research. So some questions he could have started with. Who is involved? Who can make a difference? If you remember from Comp 150, your rhetorical audience is the audience who can make a change. The people in the pews weren't the ones who could make a change, right? So they weren't doing any good. You also want to consider, what is the actual problem? What is causing it? A lot of times you'll find that the problem, the issue that grabs your attention, this increased homicide rate, is the flashing light, blinking problem that pulls you in. But the real problem is underneath that, and it goes much deeper. So you need to investigate and find out what's really causing the problem. And where is the problem taking place? It was obviously outside the church walls, and when it was at night when the church was closed. So then you want to consider, how can I contribute to this solution? And you want to think about that last, right? You want to think about everything else first, and you have to understand the problem. Why is it happening? Before you can think of what is the solution. And then, of course, you want to define your terms. So what did he do? Well, he went out to the community and he asked those questions: who, what, where, when, and why. And why is the question you really want to have drive your research. Why is this happening now? Why is this happening here? Why is this happening to these people? Why is this happening at these times of nights? These are all things you can use to investigate and really get to understand your issue. So he went out, he listened to the experts. He asked them these questions, and the people in real life, I'm sure, did not look nearly as whiny as my little stick figures. And I'm pretty sure Jeffrey Brown's ears are smaller. But there you go. He listened to the experts, and he created a program that brought police officers and parole officers and community members, the kids and the pastors, all together to actually come up with a solution that drastically reduced the violence. So before we get to the questions, I want to consider this quote from the podcast. The Boston Miracle was about bringing people together. But there is this political ploy to try and pit police brutality and police misconduct against black-on-black violence. But it is a fiction. When you think about decades of failed housing policies and poor educational structures, when you think about persistent unemployment and underemployment in a community, when you think about poor health care, and then throw drugs into the mix and a duffel bag full of guns, little wonder that you would see this culture of violence emerge. And then the response to that comes from the state is more cops and more suppression of hotspots. It's all connected. And one of the wonderful things that we've been able to do is to show that the solution is not more cops, but the solution is mining the assets there in the community. So people have a tendency to think, if you're a cop, you think it's more policing that needs to happen. If you're a preacher, you preach. If you're a teacher, you think it's all about education. If you're a counselor, you think it's about counseling and reaching out to these kids. But you have to move beyond what your preconceived idea of the solution may be and listen to other people and dive into the research and explore the ideas. So to finish this up, there are 6 questions here. I want you to pull up a Word doc and answer these questions. You can pause the video to keep the questions on the screen. And as I said, put them in the Word doc. Save that because you'll put your answers to part 2 of this discussion in that same Word doc before you copy and paste it into your discussion post.